Did you know that doctors are unable to explain 1 in every 5 cases of infertility? Scientists like me are looking at the brain for possible answers. My name is Kristen Ruka, and I'm a PhD graduate student at the University of Michigan in the Department of Physiology. Infertility affects roughly 50 million couples worldwide. Now, what I'm showing you here are 2 maps that indicate percentages of infertility by country. On the top, the primary infertility map is showing couples who have never been able to have a child. And on the bottom, the secondary infertility map is showing couples that have had a child or children, but are currently unable to have another child. Now, with 1 in 5 of these cases being unexplained, that means that there are roughly 10 million couples who have no explanation for why they're not able to have children. Now, scientists like me are looking in the brain for a possible explanation. Now, you heard right, the brain, the one in your head, controls reproductive function. Now, I'm going to tell you today what scientists do know about the brain, and also what we don't know, and how my research fits into this picture. Now, we think that the brain might play a role in some of these unexplained cases of infertility because we know that the brain controls hormones that are essential for reproductive function. And we also know that in some known cases of infertility, that problems and dysfunction with the control of these hormones have been implicated in these patients that have the infertility. So, first, let me tell you about what we do know in how the brain controls reproduction. And so to do that, I'm going to introduce you to the kingdom of reproduction. Now, this is a happening place, and the king of the kingdom of reproduction is a group of brain cells, or neurons, called GnRH neurons. Now, GnRH stands for gonadotropin-releasing hormone, and only the king's mother calls him by his full name, so you don't have to remember what GnRH stands for. But what you do need to remember is, 1, that GnRH is a hormone. And hormones are the way that organs send chemical signals into the bloodstream in order to communicate with other organs. And in this case, the organ that's communicating is the brain. The other thing you need to know about GnRH is that it is the final common output through which the brain controls reproductive function. So what that means is that any signals that would come from the brain to control reproduction would get funneled down through the output of GnRH. Now, this king has command over his kingdom, but besides that, he actually lives relatively isolated in his castle. And he wouldn't actually know what's going on in the kingdom if it weren't for advisors who actually can tell him what's happening. So in other words, these GnRH neurons aren't able to receive direct signals from the reproductive system. So, what sort of information would this king want to know about? Well, first of all, he would want to know if the kingdom has too much, too little, or just enough food. So, he has an advisor for nutrition and energy. In addition, the king would want to know if there's turmoil in the land or if there's peace. So, he has an advisor for stress. And it saddens me to say, but the king also needs to be told whether it's night or day. He really does not get out much. So he actually has an advisor for his daily rhythms to keep him in his routine. Now, of course, any king of the kingdom of reproduction would also need to know if the kingdom is functioning properly. So his most important advisor is an advisor for reproductive function. Now, of course, this system is much more complicated than this. And we also have some evidence that these advisors actually talk to each other as well. So you can imagine that any problem in the brain that might result in an inability to have children might also affect other areas as well. So for instance, problems that affect reproduction could also affect or go hand in hand with problems that affect metabolism, like diabetes or obesity. And also the hormonal imbalance that results from these problems in the brain that affect reproduction can have other unexpected results as well. And this can include abnormal hair growth, like a male pattern of hair growth on females. And you can imagine that all of these different possibilities can affect the quality of life for patients in different ways. So, To different extents, we know or don't know the identity of these different advisors, and we also are trying to find out the ways that they communicate to the GnRH neurons. But ultimately, what we'd like to do is to identify who these different advisors are, and finally, to identify targets for potential treatments of infertility and other reproductive related problems. So before we get to this point though, we need to take a lot of steps before we can finally develop these treatments. So first of all, we need to understand the basic normal function of the organs in this role. And only then can we build on that to understand what's happening to them in disease states. And finally, once we have this foundation built, then we'll be able to come up with treatments for the patients with these problems. And so this really emphasizes the importance of basic scientific research in building the fundamental foundation on which the rest of these different steps of understanding the disease and the treatments for them are built. And so my project and my dissertation project actually fits into this bottom portion, this foundation of normal function. I'm trying to figure out what's going on in the brain normally to control reproductive function. So what have I told you about so far? I've introduced you to the king of the kingdom of reproduction, the GnRH neurons in the brain. And I've also told you that he needs to be told by other portions of the brain about different input from the kingdom of reproduction on things like food, stress, the daily rhythms, and also in reproductive function. And so what I'm going to focus on today is a potential advisor for reproductive function, and that's a group of brain cells called kisspeptin neurons. Now, why do we think kisspeptin neurons play this role? Well, first of all, they're able to receive messages from the kingdom of reproduction. In other words, they're able to receive the hormones and other signals that come from the reproductive organs. Also, these kisspeptin neurons have connections to the GnRH neurons, so they're able to send messages to the king, the GnRH neurons. Now, as you can imagine, kisspeptin neurons release a chemical called kisspeptin. And a fun fact is that kisspeptin is actually named for where it was originally discovered, which is in Hershey, Pennsylvania. So kisspeptin neurons are actually named after the Hershey's kiss. Now, it turns out the king actually has a sweet tooth. When researchers give kisspeptin to these GnRH neurons, it actually excites these neurons. So with all of these different pieces of information in mind, we think that these kisspeptin neurons serve as the role as the advisor for reproduction to the king of GnRH neurons. And so this is actually what I study. I study this group of brain cells or neurons called kisspeptin neurons. Now remember, I want to find out the fundamental ways that these neurons work so that I can understand the brain and its normal function and its control of reproduction. So what kinds of questions am I trying to ask about these neurons? I want to know what's switching these neurons on and what's switching them off. In addition, I also want to know how reproductive hormones are affecting these switches. Now, neurons communicate with each other through chemical and electrical signals. And so the way I perform my experiments is I use highly sensitive equipment in order to record electrical signals, represented by the lightning bolts here. And I can record those signals from individual kisspeptin neurons at one individual cell level. So, for my initial experiments, I wanted to ask the question of one candidate for an on switch in these neurons. And so I thought neurokinin B might fit this role. And the reason I wanted to look at neurokinin B in this way is because I knew that it was present in the brain, and I also knew that there were problems with neurokinin B in some patients with certain forms of infertility. So in order to test neurokinin B in this role, first I took an electrical recording from a kisspeptin neuron, and then I treated that neuron with a chemical that mimicked neurokinin B, and I recorded the electrical signals during that treatment. And so that is what I'm showing you here with these data. So what you can see on the left are 5 seconds of data before I gave any treatment to this neuron. And what you can see on the right are while I was treating this neuron with a chemical that mimicked neurokinin B. And every one of these vertical lines represents an electrical signal that was coming from this kisspeptin neuron. So you can see that before I gave treatment, I couldn't record any electrical signals from this neuron. But after I treated with the chemical that mimicked neurokinin B, that strongly induced chemical activity in these neurons, electrical activity in these neurons. And so this provides support for neurokinin B as the on switch in these kisspeptin neurons. So we've talked about the on switch. What about a potential off switch? I wanted to test another chemical called dynorphin in this potential role. And dynorphin is another chemical that I knew was present in the brain, and I also knew that researchers had previously blocked the activity of dynorphin, and that actually increased the amount of activity in the reproductive system. And so if you're blocking something that increases activity, that suggests that it might be a potential off switch. And so to test dynorphin in this way, I actually did in a similar experiment to what I used to test neurokinin B, only instead of treating with the chemical that mimicked neurokinin B, I treated with dynorphin itself. And so that's what I'm showing you here. And you can see this kisspeptin neuron had electrical activity to start off with. And it's subtle, but you can see that when I treat with dynorphin, there are actually fewer electrical events over time. And so this supports dynorphin in that role as an off switch to these kisspeptin neurons. So I've shown you evidence for neurokinin B as an on switch in these kisspeptin neurons and for dynorphin as an off switch in these kisspeptin neurons. And that's really exciting to me as a scientist. But remember, I wanted to talk about these kisspeptin neurons and their potential role as the reproductive advisor to the GnRH neurons. And so I also needed to test to see if these kisspeptin neurons were affected by input from reproductive hormones. And so I wanted to test if these reproductive hormones affected this on switch and the off switch. Now, the experiments I showed you earlier were actually in the absence of these reproductive hormones. So what I did is I actually repeated those exact same experiments, only it was in the presence of the reproductive hormones. And that's what I'm showing you here. So the data on the top are what I showed you earlier. But what you can see is that in the presence of the reproductive hormones, when I treat with the chemical that mimics neurokinin B on the bottom, you can see that it still activates electrical activity in this neuron that I'm recording, but it actually doesn't cause as many electrical events over time. So that suggests that neurokinin B still acts as an on switch in this scenario, but it appears reproductive hormones actually inhibit that on switch, at least to an extent. So what about how they affect the off switch? Again, this kisspeptin neuron initially had electrical activity, but you can see in the presence of reproductive hormones, when I treated with dynorphin, it actually ceased the activity altogether. And so this suggests that the reproductive hormones are actually strengthening the off switch for these kisspeptin neurons. So I've shown you the on switch of neurokinin B in these kisspeptin neurons, the off switch of dynorphin in these neurons, and how reproductive hormones affect these switches by weakening the on switch effect and by strengthening the off switch effect. And so altogether, this suggests that the reproductive hormones have an inhibitory effect on the activity in these kisspeptin neurons, and that ultimately would decrease their excitatory output to the GnRH neurons, which would ultimately decrease the excitability of these GnRH neurons. Now, all of these are just some small steps towards greater understanding of how the brain controls reproductive function. And remember, I told you that the king of reproductive function in the brain is the GnRH neuron. And I've also shown you evidence now that the kisspeptin neurons serve as the role of the reproductive advisor to these GnRH neurons. Now, our ultimate goal as scientists is to identify who the other advisors are and how they communicate to the GnRH neurons and to each other. And ultimately, this will help us to identify targets for treatments of infertility and other reproductive-related problems. Now, all of this then will finally help us to reach our goal of of finding ways of helping those patients who have no way of explaining currently why they're unable to have children.